Somehow, don't ask me how, I managed to confuse the word Bradensbrook with the word Ravenhold when I submitted this abstract. Or maybe it was Black Rook Hold with Ravenhold? Or it might have been Rooksguard, or Ravencrest, or Ravencourt. The thing is, this confusion allows me to make a point. World of Warcraft is awash with these ominous, Gothic-sounding, Corvid-themed names. It rattles them out at a rate of knots, drawing on a tradition in fantasy role-playing that goes back to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons' Ravenloft in 1983. Ravens, or rooks, are oversubscribed, as coordinates go. I'm borrowing this term, coordinates, from Tanya Krzyzewska's 2015 piece in Revenant, the gamification of Gothic coordinates in video games. There, it refers to points in a complex web of discourses, expectations, and cultural semiotics that are acting within any given game environment. The coordinates here relate to the imaginary headspace that circulates around a video game, as well as to locations within that game's virtual world. Krzyzewska's paper issues a call for deeper and more sustained engagement with individual games, rather than the broad generalizations which have characterized the rush towards workable theories of computer games. It calls for a move away from pure ludology and the polemical entrenchment between narratology and ludology, towards a more diverse and focused reading of game texts. Krzyzewska's analysis, quote, attends to the experiential doing element of what it is to play a game in order to make its argument that games have the capacity to bring a new dimension to Gothic, even if that capability is by no means fully realised. End quote. She claims that, quote, Gothic is always rhetorically constituted. There are more coherent claims on the nomenclature than others, and these must be identified if we are to understand in what form Gothic appears in games. End quote. The gist of her argument is this. When video games draw on Gothic, they deploy the genre's semiotics to varying degrees of success for an audience that's varyingly familiar with them. Krzyzewska asks us whether a superficial, aesthetic, purely semiotic presence is enough to deem a particular video game Gothic. She also mentions World of Warcraft, the behemoth massively multiplayer online role-playing game, MMORPG to its friends, and this is where I come in. According to Krzyzewska, quote, Gothic is used in World of Warcraft, Blizzard 2004, with the undead race to demonstrate moral relativism. Warcraft and World of Warcraft players might recognise Arthur's journey from hero to false hero as one way that this game calls on and makes use of the Gothic, end quote. Which it is. But we can go further and talk about spaces and headspaces. World of Warcraft, which I'm going to call WoW from now on because I'm bound to start doing that out of habit even if I try to use its full name, is of interest to me as a player and a storyteller and a critic because it has so much work to do. It has a player base numbered in the millions, somewhere between 3 and 10 million. Blizzard are reluctant to reveal exactly how many, and there's constant churn as people unsubscribe, resubscribe, and stop playing but don't cancel their sub and so on. The point is there's a lot of them. All of these players have varying levels of literacy and varying levels of literary inclination. Some are really interested in the minutiae of story, some only care about how many bearskins they have to collect for their next quest. Some of them are hardcore role-players who want to feel involved in the game's narrative and actively resent being told they're a champion of Azeroth because they just want to be one cog in the big machine, just some adventurer, or even not an adventurer at all. Some of them couldn't give a rat's ass, which isn't a quest collectible yet, but give them time, about their presumed status, but still react to the aesthetics of the environment, the ethical quandaries in which the game makes them complicit, and how well the mechanics of play integrate with all that. When WoW decides that it wants to be Gothic, it has to make the semiotics of the genre work for a huge variety of reader responses and readerly techniques. It has to make them work as a game space, creating a set of Gothic coordinates to which players can find their way from a variety of starting points, and with a variety of navigational and interactive techniques. These coordinates can be geographical within the game's virtual space. They can be ethical, video games having this capacity to make a Gothic anti-hero out of us all, to ask, as WoW asks, what would you have done differently? They can also be ludological. Game mechanics surrounding location and character death can have intrinsically Gothic qualities to them, or at least be a point from which the Gothic coordinates can be triangulated. Each of these three ideas, geography, ethics, and ludology, underpin a section of the video you're about to watch. I'll be talking about the game's narrative throughout, but I am conscious that we came here to talk about space, and so I'm going to focus on how narrative creates a headspace for the player, and how successful it is in doing that. A couple more things before we get stuck into the analysis. Methodology stuff. I take a similar sort of view to Gray Carter and Cory Rydell when I say that ludonarrative dissonance is not something I think of as a problem. In fact, I try not to think about it at all. Game mechanics are not the enemy of story. You only come to that conclusion if you start off reading a video game, like a book or a film. If you do that, you will find moments where the medium doesn't work in the same way, so the techniques that you're used to finding and employing yourself break down. The proper response to this sort of thing is to build new methods of readership and storytelling, not to decide that video games are a flawed storytelling medium forever inferior to their elders and betters. When I read a video game, I prefer to think in terms of two kinds of story. Matthew Tyler Jones calls them authored and procedural. I favour emergent over procedural to distinguish it from procedural generation, the technique Diablo or Bastion used to create environments, but basically the story in the game and the story of the game. Authored narrative is what the developers put in, the semiotic cues and scripted events which provide context to gameplay and provide the hooks for player involvement. Emergent narrative is what arises from play, the events that happen when a player or group tackles the game in a particular way. When we were recording the material that you're watching now, one of our characters was hit by a rolling ball trap and almost got deaded. Her player maintains she did that to make the video more interesting, which I do not believe for a second. Now, the presence of the ball in the first place, that's an authorial decision. But what happens with the ball is an emergent event that becomes part of our narrative. The developers didn't squash Languidera, she got in the way of the ball and squashed herself. That's her authorship in that incident. That's the difference. I'm going to refer to this architecture of story a lot as we go forward, but before I get started on geography and revelation, let's just have a look at that humiliating rolling ball incident, and also at me getting lost in the secret archaeology room. There she goes. You see, when I do it, totally deliberate. Do you believe that? The lone escapee dying by the roadside is a classic of the fantasy role-playing game. It's the plot hook for Ravenloft, for one thing, and it's already priming us for the experience that we are about to have. It's followed by an aesthetic shift in our surroundings, from the bright and colourful woods of Val'sharah to the ominous cliffs and muted tones of Bradensbrook. We're moving into a more Gothic space already. You can tell from the costumes and the accents of the characters, if you can hear those as we go along as well. It's very Victorian Gothic, very Hollywood. Bradensbrook itself is exactly the kind of Gothic village that Emily Marlow talked about, although a location where the Gothic aesthetic is almost every day. Although there are supernatural events, and they are a problem, they're a problem because the town is under attack, not because of any innate fear of the supernatural. There follows some questing, where we drive back the ghosts and the carrion birds who are currently besieging the town, and we rescue the mayor's daughter and earn his trust, which I'm going to cut, because it's honestly not all that interesting unless you really want to watch someone who's bad at WoW get lost looking for crows to beat up.
with your lies, night elf. You'll stay where we can keep an eye on you.
The interesting bit starts now, when Gerald Shadowsong, that's the chap who's just jumped on the tiger there, invites us to ride with him to the Ravencrest Mausoleum. We turn up the path on the right, and with some decidedly dodgy camera work on my part, we will see Blackrock Hold looming above us, the huge ruined pile, digital Otranto looming large over the landscape, and beneath the hold we will start to uncover a little bit of a mystery.
It is just as I feared. Lord Ravencrest's remains are gone. Hail, soldier. Sage, Lord Ravencrest died long ago, but I will always revere him as my mentor. When the ancient war began, we suffered countless losses. Our cities burned. Lord Ravencrest saved our people and rescued our world from annihilation. His loss was tragic for us all. We owe him everything. Honor.
So, we're up here looking for Gerald's sister, Maiev, a hero in her own right who's disappeared while pursuing the anti-hero Illidan Stormrage. Once we're up here, though, we learn more about the shared past of these characters and the character Catalis Ravencrest, who will do some shouting while we explore the hold. This whole layered narrative in which the players are experiencing the hold as it is now, Gerald is reminiscing about the hold at its best, and the ghosts are reliving its last days, reminds me somewhat of Wuthering Heights, or the opening chapters of Dracula, or especially the Castle of Otranto. I draw on these literary examples, by the way, because the tropes originate with them. The sense of what Gothic is comes from books, and I have no intention of arguing with that. Video games only differ in their execution of the tropes. Now, in each of those texts, we are several steps removed from the original event, the titular horror of this presentation. The texts ask us to accept that characters are telling their stories to an author who is relating them to us, often anonymising their own self in the process. Video games do this sort of thing a lot, especially the survival horror genre, as Christopher Scott pointed out yesterday, by activating the experience, making us do something to get it. The norm is the scripted audio log that the player uncovers while exploring, or can uncover as a completionist challenge, with narrative revelation the reward for fully exploring the virtual space that's created. What makes it Gothic here is the semiotics of the space itself, the aesthetics of it, and also the sense that there has been a wrong done, something that warrants all this haunting that's going on. That revelatory aspect is a key technique in the Gothic. The wandering through dark corridors, uncovering lost heirlooms and secret documents, the signifiers of what took place here before, reporting them back to a reader, remediating them even as they go through their own discovery process, and the auto-triggered logs in the hold, like this one. All contributes to that sense of Gothic revelation in the Gothic location. All of this is embedded on the authorial part, but it also operates in the emergent sphere. The player character is exploring the ramparts and courtyards and dungeons of the hold, becoming the Jonathan Harker figure, part of the narrative's outermost layer, uncovering the layers beneath, remediating them to the player. It's the same storytelling device as the Gothic novel, but we're a step further in, we're viewpoint character as well as reader, doing the legwork of uncovering for ourselves. Whether or not we're the Gothic hero, though, is another matter. Our exact location in the narrative structure is up for question.
Despite our attempts to extract information, the Warden remains stubbornly resistant. Could they be talking about Maiev?
We can argue that Garrad is the Gothic hero of this narrative. I mean, it's his sister we're looking for. And that numerous characters are jostling for the role of Gothic anti-hero or villain, depending on which layer of the authorial narrative we're currently looking at. There's a distinction between hero and protagonist, which is hardly unique to video games, but useful in thinking about them. It was first pointed out to me by Lawrence Miles in his 2011 essay, Everyone's a Destroyer of Worlds These Days. If we're talking about the Gothic, we are definitely in the territory where, as Miles says, a protagonist may or may not be a goodie in the modern sense of the word hero, and where the antagonist is more likely to be the larger-than-life, too weird to live, too rare to die, classical Greek sense of heroic. But beyond that, there's a question of narrative function. Why are we, as player character, even here? What's our stake? What's our incentive? If the developers of WoW or a similar game want to author a narrative, tell a distinct story for themselves rather than rely on players to do the heavy lifting, which I think is what we're seeing in Blackrock Hold, an authored narrative, they have to leave a kind of player-shaped hole in it. They are telling a story which has to leave room for millions of player characters who might be from either of the game's two factions, from any of its 12 classes or 13 playable races. It has to appeal to players with a wide base of what Blizzard's dev team call the class fantasy. They peddle a distinct idea of what it is to be a warrior or a warlock, or in my case a monk, but those ideas are interpreted by players and coloured by preferred choices of in-game activities. It's entirely possible that a given character might have no direct connection to the Hold or its story. No reason to bite on any of the hooks being offered, save the rewards of experience, gold and treasure. Katana's doing some shouting there. I play a Blood Elf Monk, me. I don't really have any in-universe reason to be concerned about Garrad and his sister or the doings of Night Elves, other than sheer curiosity. And, I suppose, the last request of a dying woman. So it's a good job I am both nice and curious. Or at least easily led. In practical terms, this means that Blizzard has to engineer a Gothic story which could resolve itself without the player character. In case the player is largely indifferent towards it, the story needs to drive itself. Hence, Garrad's commentary on the various bits and bobs of Maiev's equipment, and his ability to arrive at various points like this one before we do. He could be getting this done himself, but we're here, and we helped him before, so why not carry on? The presence of a player character is superfluous to the authorial narrative, but it has to feel integral to the emergent narrative. We cannot just be dragged along in Garrad's wake. We're the hero of Azeroth, for goodness sake. We have to be doing something that helps him out and gives us a dynamic role in our own emergent narratives. When we start considering this as Gothic, that creates a generic oddity, a distance between the viewpoint, character and events, which doesn't quite fit the genre expectations. Jonathan Harker, or Emily St. Aubert, or Catherine Morland in Northanger Abbey are integral to the plots they move through, whereas we are awkwardly coexisting with an authored figure performing the same role. It's not that WoW can't integrate the protagonist functions of its authored and emergent narratives, but in this case it doesn't fully integrate them. It's a balancing act. Blizzard leans one way or the other to keep the game moving. In this case, they erred on the side of gameplay and class fantasy. In the next segment, we will see another approach to resolving this problem of protagonism, which is arguably better at being Gothic, but distinctly worse at being an MMO.
I am no hero, Captain, but I will gladly stand by your side.
A little bit of context for what's happening here. The content you're currently watching takes place during a later visit to Blackrock Hold as part of another plotline. We're going back in time, having a vision of the terrible events which took place thousands of years ago, and traumatised all those ghosts-to-be we encountered on our first trip. This being a video game, we're able to uncover events from the game's past in a variety of ways. Discoverable documents, dialogue with NPCs, quest text, cinematics, or, as we see here, actually playing through them, being projected into the past of the fictive environment. I find this to be the most appropriate way of delivering revelation or exposition in this medium. It's a direct experiential exposure to the tragedy that made this Gothic space what it is.
This fight isn't fair. You need to send more reinforcements against me, demons.
The flashback allows us to inhabit multiple perspectives within and around this space and its narrative. There's us, the player/reader. There's our character, the avatar of our readership and the mediatory discoverer of the revelatory narrative within the fictive universe, and the awkward co-protagonist of that narrative. And now there's Illidan here, the anti-hero, our character, and by extension we, are steering through his defining movement of sacrifice, cruelty, desperate expedience. I've cut a lot of Illidan's backstory because the questline takes about 40 minutes to play through and there's only so much I have time to show in one video. But take my word for it, he is a Gothic anti-hero. Grand destiny, spurned in love, feels second best to his twin brother, pursues forbidden knowledge and power to compensate, decorated hero of the world-shattering conflict du jour, leader of a feared but effective military elite. It's all there. You know the drill. It's an effective design choice here, because in an interactive medium like this, allowing the player to directly access and experience events is more respectful of the general point of the Enterprise than just dumping a cinematic on us and expecting us to passively receive what Tyler Jones calls narrative atoms, the discrete bits of gameplay and context that join up to make a sort of molecular story. It's also effective because it allows us to be the Gothic anti-hero, rather than witnessing his deeds and misdeeds either second-hand or on the receiving end. We're controlling Illidan here, we're complicit in what he's doing. When he drains the life out of his Moonguard troops because it's that or get stomped by demons and he has to save the world, so he chooses the lesser of two evils, it's our finger on the button. I think this is something games can do that most textual forms can't. Induce that sense of responsibility in the reader or player or participant. And I think that can be an effective deepening of the Gothic that's only possible in interactive media. While we're talking about Gothic roles, though, I want to bring up an earlier question. If Illidan's the anti-hero, who's the hero? Garrad, still? He's fighting alongside Illidan in this battle, but at the last, as we'll see at the end, he rejects Illidan's methods, decides he went too far, and it's Garrad's return to the hold and the fictive future that kickstarts the narrative as we've experienced it. It's his tide, this location, that brings us in. But if he's the hero, what does that make us? It makes me think of Manuel Aguirre's observation, that, quote, Gothic abides by fairy tale narrative rules. It's only that Gothic individual who crosses over into the other is no real hero. A key to Gothic thus resides in its centering the flawed character as protagonist, while the standard hero of traditional tales is often demoted to a helpless or passive stance. End quote. That's our in. Garrad may be our Gothic hero, but he is not the protagonist. He can afford to be a helpless and passive figure, whose story is only resolved when a catalysing agent, a player, either in their own avatarial guise or as here inhabiting Illidan, comes along to resolve things through him, alongside him. Protagonism here works in the sort of drifter sense, the hero who's just passing through, resolving other people's stories along the way. Maybe I'm sticking my neck out here, but I'd argue if, at any point, the protagonist of a video game is anyone other than the player character or characters, the developer has failed, and many do. There's a long and noble tradition of such failures in fantasy role-playing that's about as old as the hobby itself. The old j'accuse for these people is failed novelist, a claim that goes back to Gary Gygax. These people don't want you to make your own story, they want you to finish theirs. They want you to provide the impetus and the motivation to narratives that they can't resolve. The problem for our would-be Gothic game developers is integrating protagonism into the narrative architecture of the Gothic, whilst leaving space for players to move and execute decisions and interpret and project the fantasy, whatever that might be for them, and otherwise exercise their agency, and in so doing create an emergent narrative that's fulfilling and serves the generic goals of telling a Gothic story. See, Gothic is a fundamentally authored genre. The defining tropes of location, character, and plot events almost have to unfold in a particular way, or along particular lines at least, in order for the text to function as Gothic. Video games have, as I've said, a kind of molecular structure to their storytelling. Narrative atoms are associated with a particular gameplay task, a mission, or a quest, or a match, and the movement of the authored narrative is contingent on players completing that task, moving on to the next atom. In the course of play, of course, choosing to ignore the quest objective and instead create a whole chain of emergent narrative atoms is totally valid, but if you want to find out what happens next in the story in the game, as opposed to the story of the game, at some point you've got to turn the quest in, you've got to get back on the rails that the author has laid down. The author therefore has more control over the emergent narrative than the purely theoretical understanding of authored and emergent storytelling might suggest. In the current case, these discrete narrative atoms are links in a molecular chain which leads Illidan from crisis to decision to renewed crisis to decision. His crimes, his descent into Gothic anti-heroism, are predestined by the architecture of the game, and unless the player wants to faff around this flashback being Illidan Stormrage forever, they'll either have to abandon the quest chain that brought them here, or complete it and become the monster. Predestination of this kind, the fictive universe having it in for a character, shaping them into what the story needs, is arguably the heart of the storytelling process. It's also quite appropriate to the genre, really, as an explicit force and factor in the Gothic anti-hero's arc. Citing the player's perspective inside Illidan like this allows for a more concrete Gothic experience, and it reasserts the Hold as a space where Gothic things can happen, in preparation for our next visit. That next visit is going to highlight a challenge faced by all computer games, but especially multiplayer games, and especially multiplayer games which have gone out of their way to facilitate instantaneous shifts between modes of gameplay, as WoW has. In the meantime, let's enjoy Illidan making his final defiant stand, justifying his choices.
Difficult decisions had to be made, but to understand Illidan's perspective is essential if we are to succeed in our mission. What would you have done differently?
Our third visit to Blackrook Hold is a group activity, a dungeon. For those not in the know, this is a game mode for multiple players, in which we fight our way through groups of fairly trivial foes, and a number of more significant antagonists, boss fights. The bosses are minor characters. Each has an amount of story implicit in their brief snippets of dialogue during the dungeon, and a greater amount of story tucked away in the Dungeon Journal, which is an in-game function which explains a bit more about where we are, who these big scary people are, and it gives us a heads up on their mechanics. In the earliest days of WoW, dungeons were difficult, poorly explained, and not exactly easy to get to. Your avatar had to travel to the dungeon over land and sea with limited fast travel options, and you had to arrange a group of 4 other brave heroes to come with you, or meet you there, or you could take your chances with a pickup group at the entrance. The thing is, dungeons take time to design, develop, flesh out, test, rebalance, and make ready for play. After a while, Blizzard realised they were putting a lot of time and money into content which wasn't being seen on the reg by all the players. I'm apocryphally told that only 1 or 2% of the player base even saw the original 40-man raid dungeons back in the day. So, Blizzard implemented a queuing system, whereby player avatars can join an automated matchmaking service, which teleports them all to the dungeon of their choosing, or a random one, once the right number and combination of characters has been reached. Blizzard also provided incentives such as bonus loot, collectibles, accelerated appearance and reputation gains, and achievement awards for engaging with the random group finder, deliberately steering players into new habits. You can still do things the old way, and Blizzard had steered back towards this ground with the Mythic Dungeon and the Challenge mode for pre-made groups to test themselves against. But the prevailing model for most players is the random group visiting the random dungeon. I bring this up because it's created an air of disposability around the dungeon experience. The nature of a game's virtual space, how easy it is to enter and navigate, creates a headspace in which genres and narratives can take root, or not. This is not about dissonance between gameplay and narrative, mind, but about the kind of emergent narratives that the gameplay encourages, and the dissonance between those narratives, and the narratives that the developers are trying to author. It's story versus other kind of story. It is very easy to take dungeons for granted. You probably didn't choose a specific one, unless you were following a breadcrumb quest that led you in there as part of a molecular narrative chain. You probably aren't doing it with people you know, or who share your basic attitudes to and interpretations of the game, or even care about the story at all. I had to do this with guildmates, because trying to pace a pickup group, capture all the dialogue, have time to read and show the dungeon journal simply doesn't work. People want to come in, speedrun, skipping as much of the trash as possible, and complete the boss fights with minimal fuss, collect their loot and their bonus rewards, and be on their merry way. This disposable headspace makes Gothic storytelling in WoW challenging, to say the least. It's hard to evoke an atmosphere of pathetic fallacy and all-pervading gloom when some barely literate stranger with an avatar named something like Cutmeister, who's dressed in the skimpiest armour imaginable, is bouncing around, demanding a speedrun and cluttering up the screen with slurs and automated damage reports if you dare to slow down. Even my guildmates, who are, as a rule, interested in stories and immersion and integrity, have a tendency to spam cosmetic effects whenever they have to stop moving for more than a minute. I had to ask them very nicely here to behave. I do know people who roleplay in dungeons who approach them in character, proceeding at a snail's pace, investing seriously in the events taking place around them. These people are a tragic minority. I've tried it, I know I can't keep it up while I'm concentrating on actually playing the game. Despite the dissonance between forms of narrative, though, most of the bosses in Blackrook Hold represent a credible effort at authorial Gothic, even in an environment where player behaviour means the emergent narrative is probably nothing of the sort. The Amalgam of Souls, showing here, is a cluster of tortured ghosts, valiant defenders of the Hold, who, once defeated, separate into their component identities again, and unlock the rest of the dungeon, as you see. The winding corridors of the Hold's interior lead us from this mausoleum-like space into the presence of Lord Ravencrest's daughter, herself a tragic anti-heroine in the vein of Illidan Stormrage, who's returned to her father's castle and is defending his delusional reality from intruders like what we are, and we saw that fight at the very beginning of this video. The final fight, which is coming up, against Lord Ravencrest himself and his most trusted advisor, occurs at the very pinnacle of the Hold. In a rooftop battle, we free Ravencrest by destroying his resurrected body and reveal his advisor to be an agent of the Burning Legion, the demons who ruined the Hold in the first place and have been the architects of all our pain since we arrived. Ravencrest is undoubtedly the victim here, although his position as a final boss and his ghostly condition misrepresent him as a Gothic villain in his own right. It's a pretty basic subversion of gameplay expectations and genre expectations, all things considered, but it's not an unsatisfying one, and we have been well primed to expect something fishy by the confusion that various Ravencrest associates have displayed on the way up here. I imagine that if one hadn't bothered to read up on him in the dungeon journal, showing here, it might even come as a surprise, although if Blizzard didn't provide a dungeon journal, players would be sure to data mine the dungeon during testing and spoil the surprise for everyone by posting guides to the optimal strategy. And why wouldn't you? It's a game. The point is to beat it. This, as Kuzvinska tells us, is the fundamental issue at the heart of video game Gothic. To quote, "Games and puzzles are built on the notion that there is a solution, a winning condition, and many games that we might easily call Gothic are therefore caught up within a polarisation between the generic vocabulary of games, where players are catalysts for redemption, and the inescapable sense of loss and entropy that characterises Gothic." End quote. This is a problem of headspace and attitude, a problem of game stories versus Gothic stories. Gamers, as a rule, don't like Pyrrhic victories that much. This is a broad generalisation, and there are exceptions, but as a rule, unless the less than desirable outcome is framed as an obvious sequel hook, I feel we prefer the authored narratives of our games to come out in victory. We definitely like the emergent narrative to come out in victory. We want to beat the game. There's an added complication that death for a player character in an MMO cannot be permanent, unless the player has chosen it to be so, by subscribing to a challenge like WoW Iron Man or going really hardcore with the role-playing. The expectation in this genre is that death is merely a setback. Avatar's equipment will take some damage, they may have to corpse run back to where they died or ask very nicely to be resurrected, but they ain't dead forever. There are whole plot points that turn around it. The game goes so far as to explain that some characters, like all playable demon hunters, can't actually be killed, justifying the game mechanic within the imagined world. Now, I still think the term ludonarrative dissonance is, if not bunk, overrated, but I also admit that the relative cheapness of death in WoW does create a practical problem for storytellers. Once death is no longer a permanent or even especially significant outcome, the consequences of death start to lose their weight. Grief is not a particularly strong emotion when the first thing that springs to mind upon a death is, "Can't you just res her?" It's just as true for the emergent narrative as for the authored. I could cry for Aguirre when she was butchered by the Amalgam of Souls, and WoW goes so far as to provide me with a sardonic emote for doing so. But my resurrection ability is right there, and if we're going to get on with this dungeon, our healer has to live. The novel Mogworld by Yahtzee Croshaw is set in a WoW-like MMO, and it centres on this idea, poking and prodding at the meaning of death, in a world where nobody really dies. In a closing flourish, a fictional review of this fictional game in his own acerbic style, Croshaw points out that permanent death completely throws off our sense of how MMORPGs should work. Now, part of Croshaw's overall critical perspective is that highlighting the oddities of game mechanics, whether accidentally or on purpose, brings them to players' attention. It creates the sort of splinters on which immersion can't help but catch and become unravelled. If the game reminds us that we're playing a game, the integrity of its authored narrative is compromised, while its emergent narrative is tainted by our anger. WoW can't help but do this when it does death, and it doesn't have the flexibility to turn a Gothic narrative on much else. It's unable, for instance, to talk about rape, or even to seriously talk about sexual desire at all, without sacrificing its suitable for 12-year-olds rating. In Blackrook Hold, WoW makes Kurtalos here the site of defeat and loss and entropy, so we don't have to endure them. Once again, the weight of the Gothic genre falls on an authored character, leaving the player avatar free to exit the hold in whatever direction they see fit. Undoubtedly, towards victory. I said earlier that citing the player's perspective in an authored character cements the Gothic, gives it a chance to set properly. That's the success of using Illidan for one section of gameplay in the hold. It's a mechanical commitment by Blizzard, the decision to give us some Gothic gameplay, where our options are either give up altogether or see it through, make the sacrifice, become the anti-hero. That's more difficult to achieve for the player avatar, who might at any moment abandon their current plotline because the player fancies a trip to the arena, or a random dungeon, or a pet battle, or just wants to go back to town with the click of a finger, because the game has obliged itself to make all these things possible. Right now, I've come back to Blackrook Hold on a flying visit to complete an arena quest, which is only cited here because the courtyard of the hold makes a great location for this kind of gameplay and looks interesting and spooky. The headspace of WoW is built around convenience, access and agency. The virtual spaces it offers have to be reused regularly to make them worth the investment of creating. This creates a certain kind of headspace and attitude, limiting the game's generic potential. It can imitate the Gothic, but it can't quite pull it off. Players have to consciously adjust their expectations and attitudes and commit to the Gothic experience, or be committed to it by an imposed style of gameplay. In WoW, the complete Gothic can only really prosper in the text chat-based role-playing that some guilds exist to foster. Players have to buy into it, and mechanics have to deny them an easy out. It is not possible to integrate the Gothic fully with the convenience that WoW players have come to expect of their gameplay, or the picaresque emergent narratives that the game thrives on creating and with which its mechanics are most in tune. I do think that an immersive, consequential Gothic video game is possible. Tabletop RPGs have been doing it for years and have been adapted semi-successfully to the digital. The medium has produced some solid attempts of its own. Like Christopher Scott, I was very taken with Resident Evil 7, and if that had been out when I conceived this paper, you might have sat through a presentation on intimacy, isolation, virtual spaces, southern and sci-fi Gothic instead of this one. It might have run into the same problem of endings, but that state of, quote, defeat, loss and entropy, end quote, can be achieved if the protagonist just walks off into the sunrise alone, winning for everyone but themselves. And I think that fits the genre and audience expectations. I think that delivers. We win, but we're still kind of lost. The right-authored narrative can create Gothic expectations and a headspace which fosters a Gothic emergent narrative. There's also the option of sandbox games, which are more toward the emergent than the authored. They reinforce a sense that the whole world goes on and on, that we can only win small victories. That might work, and sandboxes also give the larger Kvinzvinska's suggestion that games have to be winnable, because you don't win a sandbox, you just get bored of it and play something else after a while. But I'm not sure it can be done in this game, the dominant influencer in its genre, which makes me wonder how possible a Gothic MMO is without being dangerously unlike the model of proven MMO success, which makes me worried for Paradox Interactive's upcoming adaptation of Werewolf the Apocalypse, but we'll see. WoW prospers by attempting to be all things to all players. Generally, it makes credible attempts. It's not the best at anything, but it's good enough at damn near everything. Blackrook Hold is an attempt, in that spirit, to make a Gothic space out of this little corner of the world of Warcraft. Player avatars can visit for a while, players can commit to a sustained exploration, but sooner or later we have to emerge and go off to another genre for a while. Thanks for watching. Any feedback that you have, please leave it in the comments. I want to make more videos like this, so I'm interested in seeing how well it's worked.